and we'll get started shortly after. So let's give her a round of applause. So I was totally not planning to do this. This is like a past life, really. I used to do spoken word when I was a lot younger. And so I actually wrote this piece literally, I think, my second or third year teaching. So that had to be like 2005, 2006 or something like that. And it was inspired by a student that I had, actually several students. And it's, I think, relevant to this conversation. So when they said they need a little time, I was like, you know what? I will resurrect this. But bear with me, because I literally have not done spoken word in years, and I have not read this in years. So here we go. It's called Lost Identity. She said she wished she were black. She said she wished she were black, and there wouldn't be anything wrong with that, but for the fact her skin tone glowed golden. Face-shadowed sadness as I turned my mirrored gaze to search in her round brown eyes, framed by the telltale single-folded eyelids. The eyes that were subject to so much scrutiny during World War II, used to differentiate between the Jap and the Chinese ally, and later used to label the gooks during the Vietnam War. The eyes that sometimes reflected so much self-hatred that surgery techniques were created to make them look more Western all across Asia, techniques I still see used today and used increasingly. These were the eyes that she wished were double-folded, even rounder, with thick, long, curled lashes, eyes that she wished didn't give away her ethnic Asian roots. And I could relate to how she felt. Instead of growing up in an urban neighborhood where the majority of people are black and brown-skinned, I grew up for many years in a suburban bedroom community in the Midwest, where in my grade there were perhaps 2, maybe 3 token families of color. That made it easy to pair us up when we got to the age where adolescent crushes gave way to blushing cheeks after a smile or nod was set in the right direction. And no matter who my crush or of the week, month, or year was, I always seemed to be coupled, at least by my classmates, with Tim Wong or Kevin Lee. And even though I did share my first kiss at 11 years of age with a white boy named Judd, it stung to the bone when my friend informed me later in the year that my biggest crush of all would never be with someone who looks like you. Despite my efforts to fit in, I packed my own American lunches with a bologna and cheese and made the right friends and even made the 7th grade cheerleading team. I remember thinking to myself, I wish I had blonde hair and blue eyes. And that's just how it is for so many Asian American kids who find themselves outside of certain pockets of yellow power and yellow's beautiful havens, mostly on the West Coast and Hawaii, where majority standing and common experiences more successfully shield kids from the sideways stares or perpetual foreigner status that haunt too many of us lost in communities of other colors. It is in these environs that we often have an odd faux choice: to accept honorary white status and present ourselves as non-threatening, assimilating, stereotypically hardworking and deferring, promise we won't cause any trouble or inconvenience you all, good neighbors whose food we are willing to share but culture we don't dare to impose at all. Or to define ourselves as people of color, where oftentimes the brown and black folk you identify yourself with don't see you as another person of color or know anything of your history of oppression in this country, and the majority of people who do look like you don't identify themselves with your political beliefs either. This is where you are constantly battling deep-rooted stereotypes about martial arts, female submissiveness, male asexuality, math, and, well, at least your stereotype is that you're all smart. So it is no surprise to me that this pretty girl before me, who lacks the self-esteem and confidence to see her own beauty, wishes her roots weren't Asian and is trying to gain weight so she can look more desirably thick like many of her black female friends. She's trying so hard to find acceptance in a society that does not appreciate her beyond the confines of an identity that others cannot seem to understand or relate to. Lost somewhere in an abyss straddling generational misunderstandings from the homeland, in a home and a land where she does not feel entirely accepted, she is certainly not alone. The pressures are hard to bear, the isolation very real, and when I discovered the little-known fact that Asian American females have some of the highest rates of suicide for all ages and ethnicities, I was sad, but not surprised. These are the challenges we face in a country that we know better than any other, but does not know us. Erroneously lumped together in a homogenous group since our ancestors traversed and settled the shores of the Americas in the 1500s, and yes, there were Asians in the Americas even then, our bond is a cyclical history of exclusion, massacre, and rejection. It is also a history of resilience, defiance, and courage in the face of unrelenting injustice. Tragically, for generations of Asian American children seeking a sense of self, these stories are missing from the pages of textbooks in the memory of a nation. The contributions live on, from the Bing cherries and nectarines to the heroic actions of the highly decorated but segregated 442nd Regiment, to the Transcontinental Railroad irrigation of the West and the legacy of Vincent Chin. This is what I needed as a young girl, perplexed and unhappy with my own reflection. And this is what I began to share with the girl who wished she was something other than herself.
Wow. I'm like so shook. Okay. So we'll just start with the evening, everyone. So hello, welcome. My name is Hannah Lee, and I'm a student in the Prevention Science and Practice program here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. To begin, I wanted to extend a warm welcome to each of you from all of us here at HGSE. And happy Asian Pacific Islander American Month. As we welcome this month to celebrate the diversity and richness our community brings to the United States, I hope this evening's conversation will be a space for you all to engage meaningfully. Just as a housekeeping reminder, please refrain from using the front two doors where you entered to keep distractions minimal. There are two side doors that you may use. So when the Pan-Asian Coalition for Education, PACE for short, here at the Ed School first started planning for this event, most, if not all of us, had several unsettling experiences where we had either felt intentionally or unintentionally included or excluded when it came to conversations about race, justice, equity, and all of the complex implications it had for us as educators, activists, and researchers. We had individual conversations with many Asian identifying classmates and even faculty about being misunderstood, underrepresented, and silenced. These experiences led us to an urgency of the need to organize together and create a space for dialogue as a whole. When the event was published, we were expecting a turnout of no more than 30 or 40 people, mainly those from our immediate networks and friends. However, as word got out about this event, those of us in PACE watched it grow to attracting over 1,900 interested people on Facebook, tickets being sold out on Eventbrite, eventually needing for us to live stream this event and book overflow rooms. This incredible volume of interested participants from all over the country was only indicative to us that there was a lack of institutional space that provided room for conversations about Asian American identity and thus the oppression, marginalization, and certainly a wide gamut of experiences that Asian and Pacific Islander Americans experience as minorities, as people of color. And people of color we are. Brown, yellow, tan, light. The Pan-Asian community represents more than 40 countries, including Vietnam, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, Laos, and more. We also have differing immigrant, socioeconomic, regional residents, educational, familial, and cultural backgrounds. Yet in this community that is quite colorful, no pun intended, where we belong in conversations about race and ethnicities have been ambivalent. In fact, in 2013, an Asian American woman named Lindsay Yu wrote an op-ed for NPR titled Feminism and Race, Just Who Counts as a Woman of Color. In this piece, she recounted her experience in a college sociology class where she asked to see the perspective of Asian Americans in what she was learning. Some professors told her to look at the statistics of white people, or insinuated that Asian Americans had no bearing on racial justice. She shared that she's been told since high school that Asian Americans are not relevant, that our voices and experiences matter only when high schoolers turn their pages to the obligatory paragraphs in their world history reading that briefly address Chinese railroad workers. The Asian American experience, despite spanning several generations of struggle and oppression, is rendered invisible. Lindsay Yu concluded her op-ed in NPR by sharing that only when our efforts and agitation towards dismantling racial hierarchies make sense, only when we include, legitimize, and strengthen the voices of all people of color. To this, I and those of us from PACE couldn't agree more. To lead our discussion tonight is Tony De La Rosa. Tony is a Filipinx-American educator, writer, spoken word poet, social activist, and budding sriracha chef. We'll see. He's also my friend. At HGSE, he is a student in the Arts and Education program and has served as a tri-chair for the 16th Annual Alumni of Color Conference and as a Communication Fellow through the Voice program. Furthermore, our wonderful and esteemed panelists are Asian American leaders in the field of education and diversity and inclusion. Kamal Basin has been the principal of Up Leonard, a district public turnaround school since 2013. Prior to working at Up Academy, Ms. Basin was a principal of Excel Academy Charter School and served as a founding assistant principal of a KIPP-affiliated school in New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Prior to that, she was a science and English teacher in New Orleans. Dr. Kimberly Trong is a director of inclusion programs in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the Public T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She is actively involved as co-chair of the Association of the Harvard Asian and Asian American Faculty and Staff and serves as a commissioner on the Asian American Commission of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Ms. Jessica Tang is the president of the Boston Teachers Union, representing 10,000 active and retired educators. She is a co-founder of the teacher activist group Boston and serves as a board member for several civic and labor groups, including Citizens for Public Schools and Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. She is a teacher activist and has been involved in many different community organizations that are working to advance racial, social, and economic justice. Jessica serves as a vice president of both the Massachusetts AFL-CIO and American Federation of Teacher Massachusetts, and is a former co-chair of the Massachusetts Asian American Educators Association, and also is serving a 3-year term on the New England Federal Reserve Advisory Board. Dr. Josephine Kim, a mentor and beloved professor of many of us here, but especially mine, has a dual faculty appointment in prevention science and practice, CAS, in counseling programs at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and in the Department of Oral Health Policy and Epidemiology, hard word, at School of Dental Medicine. She is also on the faculty at the Center for Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness at Massachusetts General Hospital. She is a licensed mental health counselor and a national certified counselor. She has worked with multicultural populations through individual, group, and family counseling, and has taught students of all ages in varied educational contexts, including private and public language schools and private and public colleges and universities. Dr. Kim has provided professional consultation and expertise on multicultural mental health, career development, and educational issues to various media sources in Asia and in the U.S. She is USA Today's collegiate case study expert on school violence and has been featured in EBS and KBS programs in Korea related to developmental and mental health issues of youth. She is a former resident fellow in the Administrative Fellowship Program at the Office of the Assistant to the President for Institutional Diversity and Equity at Harvard University and is a Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Harvard School of Dental Medicine. And last but not least, Dr. Tommy Chang currently serves Boston Public School as superintendent. Under Dr. Chang's leadership, the district operates under 3 core values of equity, coherence, innovation, with a focus on fostering safe, welcoming, and sustaining learning environments for all students. He continues to publicly stand up for the rights of students of all backgrounds, including immigrant and transgender students. Prior to joining BPS, Dr. Chang served as the local instructional superintendent of the Intensive Support and Innovation Center at the Los Angeles Unified School District, LAUSD, where he oversaw 135 schools and approximately 95,000 students. A former biology teacher at Compton High School and a founding principal of charter school in Venice, California, Dr. Chang previously served also as a special assistant to the superintendent of LAUSD. He is a native of Taiwan who immigrated with his family to the U.S. at the age of 6, and also a member of Chiefs for Change, a nonprofit bipartisan network of diverse state and district education chiefs. We are incredibly lucky and privileged to have them here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming our panelists for this evening.
Come on in. Whew. I'm so excited to be here. Whew. We've been waiting for this moment for a while. I wanted to start us off. I'm really into Paulo Freire. Snap if you are a big fan of Paulo Freire in this room. Any Paulo Freire? Oh, Paulo Freire, Brazilian philosopher, educator, who is author of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, who helps us understand the idea of education as an exchange and really talk about the power dynamics in education. So I want to bring him into this space as well, also bring in my own ancestors into the space, Lapu-Lapu, who's a decolonizer, and one of our first ever Filipinx dismantlers. He overthrew Ferdinand Magellan as he was coming to the Philippines. So I will remember that moment. You are in this space. What I want us to do before we even start this panel is also think about who are those ancestors as well, who are we bringing into this space. I know we come from a lineage of resilience, as Hannah was outlining as well, of resilience, of oppression, of invisibility. So take a few moments, if you would be willing to close your eyes, think of that person, and bring them into this space. And then on the count of three, let's take a one collective breath. 1, 2, 3. Because this ain't an easy topic, y'all. So when we were thinking about hosting this panel, me and Hannah were talking. We're like, let's use what we've been learning at Harvard, right? Like let's use this theory of social change to really ground us in that, what we're trying to get at, right? Like what is the end goal here? So we wrote down literally, if we hold a space for Asian Americans to understand their positionality as POC, then they will feel empowered to advocate for themselves and our community in their respective context. Fancy. So that's kind of like grounding us in this space, and I want to recognize that we come in at different levels of diversity, equity, and inclusion competency in this space, so I want to acknowledge that as well. Some people have never... Snap if you heard the term person of color. Okay. Snap if you've identified with that term. Okay. Snap if you're an educator. Just trying to get a pulse of the room. And snap if you ever felt invisible. Word. So just give us a pulse of going in. I'm going to start us off real easy for all of us on the panel. The first question is, in your own experience and expertise, how have Asian Americans either been included or unincluded as being people of color? Your experience and or expertise. So we can just go down the line. Whoever feels moved to answer first can go through.
So in terms of education research, Asian Americans, for me, just as a researcher, I've seen in education research, Asian Americans are always lumped with whites, and so we're not included as people of color. And I work at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, where Asian Americans are not considered URM, so that's underrepresented minority. As a Southeast Asian American, I'm the first in my family to graduate from high school. My mom has a 6th grade education, my dad has a 9th grade education, so I've often felt invisible and not included as an Asian American or as a person of color. And the times when I've been included have been in affinity spaces where there are other people of color who are accepting, so of other races who are Latinx, Black, Native American, as well as multiracial individuals. So there's been some really great spaces in my field in higher education. So there's binders. If you're involved in Facebook, there's a secret Facebook group for women of color that I'm a part of. It's called Binders of something, but
secret on Facebook.
Yeah. So there are spaces that I've found that have been really supportive, and I've had a lot of really great mentors who are not Asian Americans who have included me within the term people of color.
Like, where do I begin? So I would say, I guess, I'll just, a couple examples pop up in my head most quickly, so I'll talk about those. One, I think that in terms of educators of color spaces, we actually, at the Teacher Activist Group, we started that in, I think, 2006 or 2007. We intentionally created our own space because we didn't feel like it existed. And so we created our own educators of color socials, and we were intentional about including and actually defining, what do we mean by people of color? When we say Asian, let's talk about, the Middle East too, and like be inclusive. And so we just kind of created our own space, and I'm really happy that that work actually then led to the, in Boston Public Schools, we actually pitched the idea to one of the folks who was doing diversity in BPS and said, hey, can we do these like educators and socials together? And BPS kind of just took it on, and we kind of lost our, partnership in it, but that's okay as long as it's happening. And so there's like this whole Alana network now in BPS where there's socials for educators of color, and we are still invited to that space, and it's great. We talk about Mai and things like that, and it's been welcoming. But another space where I think I really struggle, and we're struggling to actually have visibility, is within labor movement. And so, I'm a union labor leader, as much as I didn't know that I would end up being that.
Step, y'all.
And I'm proud of that. I'm the first Asian American who was on the AFL-CIO Executive Council, for example. It is me and about 50 or 60 older white men, and like maybe 4 or 5 women and a couple other people of color. Just honestly, that's the space. And so a few of the other labor leaders who are Asian American and I have started the APAHM chapter, Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance in Massachusetts, to create that space. Because while we actually do have a high percentage in some of the unions of Asian Americans, there isn't really a leadership presence or just kind of an acknowledgement that, hey, there's a lot of Asian American, and Unite Here, for example, the hotel workers in Chinatown, and making sure that our rank and file workers have a voice too. And so that's, again, sometimes we are at the point where we are creating those spaces oftentimes, intentionally.
Good evening. First of all, I just want to acknowledge how awesome it is to be in this space, and for all of you being here. It's actually a pretty recent experience for me to be in spaces like this, because I didn't really grow up in an environment where these spaces exist. So I think I'm not going to take it from a research perspective or an education perspective. I'm just going to take it from a very personal perspective. Should Asian Americans be considered people of color? I'm going to explain why it's yes. If white and people of color are binary, let's say, and white is defined as your identity being predominantly affirmed and sustained and recognized in your life, then Asian Americans are people of color.
Well said. Woo.
That's it.
We're done, y'all.
So I chose the most, I'm fangirling out because I'm sitting next to the superintendent, but I'm also, now I have to follow the superintendent. Not good thinking, should have sat way over there. I think agreement with all that's been said. From a personal experience, I sort of first encountered this as an educator when I was teaching in Louisiana in St. John the Baptist Parish, which is what they called school districts, because there's separation of church and state. At the time, the district I was working for was sort of called into sort of an investigation because it was found to be in violation of Brown versus Board of Education, in that there was a predominantly white staff and serving predominantly students of color. And that was found to be sort of in many ways a segregated school. And so there was a move made to collect data on the staff's demographics. And we were given a form in a staff meeting, and you were to check how you identified. And it said black or white. And I think that was one. There's been many times in professional settings where I felt invisible, but that was a very explicit example of where I actually had no idea how to comply with the task that had been given to me, and was sort of my job was now contingent upon identifying in this way because we were to be redistributed across the district. And so I went to my principal and asked her, which one. I'm confused about how I respond to this question. And she kind of looked at me and said, yes, I think with your mixed white and black heritage, that would be confusing. And I said to her, well,
Oh, wow.
that would be confusing for someone with that heritage as well. And she said, oh my goodness, are you Hispanic? And it just did not occur to her, this concept that, and when I said I identify as Asian American, she also didn't understand because, in her conception, she was thinking of a different part of Asia. And so I think in a professional setting, this was a very confusing interaction. and ultimately ended up, and like we ended up resolving the situation. I like wrote a box other and clicked that. But I think that sort of speaks to like when we talk about race, like where do Asian Americans fit in? But another way in which I have definitely felt invisible is in my desire to be like an advocate for social justice. And there's been many times like within the Asian American community, I have felt invisible among my peers by my desire to be a strong ally to other communities of color. Which is why it's exciting to sort of be in this space. I've in some ways sometimes shied away from identifying as Asian American because I have sort of felt that invisibility. And finally, I think in a third way, particularly more recently, as a sort of approach my 10th year in school leadership, I've often been felt invisible because I've been invited sort of to be implicitly supporting the systems of oppression that exist. And sort of in a token way, been invited to enter spaces as a leader of color, in which I'm sort of asked to speak for communities that I don't feel comfortable speaking for. And when I attempt to, elevate voices from those communities, I'm sort of met with discomfort and sort of a why can't you play along? And so there's been many ways in which sort of throughout my career that I have felt invisible in many different spaces.
That's because they still think you're black and white.
Right.
It's like, why can't she talk about these issues? Yeah. Wow, first, what a star-studded panel, right? Can we give them another hand? Wow. I think probably we can all think of examples and situations in our lives where we have been included and where we've also been excluded, right? Would you agree that we can probably all think about that? I think the important thing to really highlight for us is that how many times do we volunteer to be excluded or included in those situations? Oftentimes it's not by choice, and it's oftentimes, I would say, for somebody else's convenience, right? That we're oftentimes used. If they include us, it's for somebody else's gain. If they exclude us, it's also, for somebody else's gain.
Yeah. So I'm going to go into this next portion of this, the questions where I'm going to actually specify some of the questions for each panelist, and then so we can get to your questions. And I know all y'all brought questions into this space. So for this next question, it's for Kamal and Jessica. What makes building coalitions with other POC affinity groups difficult in your field and in your experience?
I'm still writing down the question to process it.
I'll do it. You know what? I should do this. I should always repeat it. So what makes building coalitions with other POC affinity groups, as Kamal was alluding to, very difficult? As an Asian American.
You feel free to start. I have some thoughts. But...
Thank you. Well, I think I heard Brittany Packett say at one point, I often lead by thinking about ways I'm oppressed, but instead I need to think about the privilege I have and how to leverage that. And I think that, I do consider myself a person of color, but I also recognize that my experience with oppression is very different from that experience by other communities of color. And so, like Indian people are not being rounded up and shot by police. This is like, flying while brown is a real thing. I've been pulled off airplanes multiple times, but I've never feared for my life in those situations. And I think that is a very real distinction. And our community there's much that we can do to focus within ourselves as a community and identify and dismantle the oppression that we do face. But I do think we need to make sure we do that not at the expense, right, of elevating and being strong allies to other communities of color. And I think that that tension always makes partnerships between communities difficult, right? Because in some ways it can feel like a zero-sum game, like a fight for resources. And it should not be that. This is not the oppression Olympics. This is about, right, like, unfortunately, though, it sometimes becomes that. And it is presumptuous of us to assume that we understand or can speak for the challenges that all communities of color face. But we can empathize. And we absolutely should feel responsibility for tackling those challenges together. and making sure that if we're invited to speak into a space to speak for communities of color, that we're elevating voices who can most authentically speak to those challenges. And when I think about speaking invitations that have been extended to me, always I'm honored, but often it is my responsibility to pass and suggest a voice from a community who would be better positioned to speak to those challenges and to use my privilege in that way. So I think that can be challenging, though, and it's hard to know how to navigate those.
How do you ask that person, say, like, this topic is not relevant to me, but I know you, because you are X, Y, and Z, can you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I definitely understand where you're coming from.
Totally agree with everything you said. And I guess the two other thoughts I'll share, I had a similar thought, which is that it kind of goes back to actually the piece I shared earlier, right? Is that there's a lot of history of experiences that we don't know about each other, even in communities of color. And when we don't take the time to, I think, learn and honestly have like a shared analysis of racism, how it impacts different people within the spectrum, and then also acknowledge our own prejudices too. I think that is important. And so in a lot of, I think our work is in our own community. Like, for example, we need to address anti-Blackness.
Yes.
And how Asian Americans have benefited from anti-Blackness, right? And so if we're going to be true allies and in communities of color, then we have to do the own work within our own communities too. And I think if we're not willing to do that, then it can create challenges because our struggles aren't seen within a shared analysis of each other. I'll end there.
Yeah, amazing. This next question is going to be for Dr. Joe and Dr. Kim. How does the difference of experiences...
Dr. Kim Trong.
Dr. Kimberly
Dr. Joe Kim.
Dr. Joe, my first time, y'all, as you can tell. It is live action. This is live action moment. How does the difference of experiences between Asian Americans and international Asian students in the U.S. influence the overgeneralization that is common amongst Asian groups? Something that exists in... If this existed at your school or your organizations, please snap. Yes. We gotta... Yes. So take it away, either one of you. So we look at this one.
Well, I feel like we have to disaggregate as well too when we think about the experiences of Asian Americans. They're so diverse that we have to think about that in terms of international students as well too. A lot of international students come here and they're often privileged and middle income. So people tend to generalize that Asian Americans are middle income, highly educated, and well off. Whereas when you think about some Asian American groups have come to the U.S. as refugees, and others have come here as indentured servants as well. So that experience isn't really shared, or that experience isn't understood because everyone believes that there's one monolithic Asian experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to just the way we're socialized. We're socialized to look at somebody the way they look and their general phenotype of their face and immediately place them in a category, right? So anytime we do that with any people group and we minimize who they are simply by, again, the way they look, then there's an issue with that. And it doesn't matter who you do it to. Doing it to anybody is wrong, right? But developmentally, too, if you think about it, so international students as well as Asian American students were both viable and substantial as well as really valuable members of the academia, for example, right? And yet there are such differences. One of the differences is that developmentally international students, let's say you're coming for college, you're not going to be as impacted, for example, with racial oppression as somebody who grew up in the U.S. as, a 6, 7-year-old being called chink all the time. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because you're coming at a stage in life where your identity is already pretty set. Right? You've put a lot of work into developing your identity, and What's happening with international students is you come into a national narrative that exists, and oftentimes you can't understand that narrative because it's here and people are treating you a certain way and you just don't know why that's the case, right? Yeah. But for a lot of Asian Americans, especially for those of us who have faced personal experiences of oppression and discrimination, etc., there's a different type of pain associated with that. And it also hurts when somebody would identify you as being an international student, because all of a sudden, all of those experiences are erased, right? And that's a big part of who we are, right?
There's an article that I'd like to share from Gerald Wing-Soo and his colleagues from 2007 about microaggressions and the experiences of Asian Americans. And one of the first microaggressions is that Asian Americans are the perpetual foreigner, again, linked to international student experiences.
Amazing. You all alluded to like the data disaggregation and the need for that. It's something that's dear to my heart. As we know in Massachusetts, that was a bill that was posted this year. And I, too, kind of fought for it with my co-chair, Paulina Hadong, who can't be here right now because she's in comps as a PhD student. And yes, I am praying for her right now. It's the testing season for her. But we went there, we went to the State House to fight for data disaggregation. And this is new to me. I knew it was necessary. I knew that as a Filipinx American, our history is eclipsed many a time, all the way back to the farmers movement with Larry Itilong being eclipsed by Cesar Chavez, and then not having that presence and also the privilege of being honored for doing all the work that he put into the farmers movement for our liberation. So I fought naturally for that. Dr. Josephine Kim reached out. She's like, go in there. I'm like, all right. So I go in there, and I'm expecting, I don't know what I'm expecting, but when I went there and I look around, I'm like, yo, these are brothers and sisters. They don't want this bill, though. They're Chinese, some Chinese American. And that was intense to like realize when I looked into that room. Chinese supporting, or Trump supporting Chinese groups there were in big quantity, and they came through with their groups and their numbers, and definitely had a valid piece to say, but the aspect of bringing visibility to the invisible needed to happen. So what do you guys make of this? What do y'all make of this bill now that it's been pushed forward? As in, it's now extended to all racial and ethnic groups. Do you think it's going to pass? I think it's, I'm going to get it wrong,
3361.
3361, but now is an addendum piece to 4485, I believe. Don't quote me on that, people. But what do you make of that, Jessica and Dr. Chang?
I'll start.
Do you think it will pass? What do you feel about that? Do you feel like we can mobilize to make it something that we see and access?
I'm not going to predict politics in this state.
Smart.
Yeah. But there are two sides to it. I think obviously data can be used for good or bad. There has been moments in our country's history, in this country's history, where the designation of Japanese did lead you to be interned, and so there are some of those memories are very fresh still, and I think about my work, and I think about the data we collect and the data we purposely do not collect. If I had the immigration status of young people in this country, I could help support the immigrant experience. I am an immigrant to this country. It is a very different experience, but I can't collect that data right now. It's not something that's safe, and so you're constantly wrestling with these sort of moral dilemmas. And it's not right. It's not. I don't know if it's the right time to do it. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I do know if this data is collected and we used it for good, we can really differentiate and be purposeful and precise with the type of services we provide to Asian Americans and other ethnic groups. because we all have very different lived experiences. So I personally am questioning, is this the right time to do something like this? So. And Massachusetts is while a blue state and liberal state, it's not all that progressive. So we have to be careful.
Yep.
But that was very nuanced and honest, because it's true. I mean, in the Boston Teachers Union, folks ask us, like, we have undocumented teachers, and I don't need or want to know who they are, actually, in order to protect them. However, I have been actively working to pass this legislation, so I did testify at the State House and spoke about the need for disaggregated data specific to meeting the needs of our students and also health needs, et cetera. There is a difference, for example, not just even in the Asian American community. We know, well, I shouldn't generalize, we know, but when I studied here at Hugsy, I learned that, the Asian American community is very bipolar in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of educational attainment, in terms of if you came here as a refugee or if you came here through different immigration status, et cetera. And similarly, for African Americans or students who identify as Black, there's differences too between if you're a Caribbean student or if you're an immigrant from Nigeria or an African American descendant of slaves. So the disaggregation of the data, I think, is important in that if we're going to get to the root of any sort of problem and create the right supports for different student populations, then we need the more detailed information to figure out, well, is something like Asian American achievement masking different groups that actually are not achieving at the same rates, right? And so I do think that disaggregated data is really important, and this legislation is a step in the right direction, and fully support it. Now, whether or not it will be passed, I think, it's hard to predict. I will say I was also disheartened by the numbers of people who came out against it from the Asian American community. I also was really disheartened by that. And I think that's part of our work, though, is how do we build bridges with those folks and help them understand, like, yes, I think some of their concerns come from a place that has some legitimacy. However, the benefits of this data can greatly benefit, actually, Asian Americans in the community. And that's going to take a lot of conversations and a lot of work and a lot of bridge building and a lot of education, and we have to do it.
I love how you're alluding to or just stating this idea, this need for radical compassion for other communities and different thought for us to meet and push things forward, right? This next question is about mental health and well-being in the API community, and this one will be for Kamal, Dr. Josephine Kim, Dr. Kimberly H. Trong. How can seemingly positive stereotypes about Asian identifying students, such as the model minority myth, lead to detrimental effects for students' well-being?
What the clinical background?
Well, what's the purpose of a stereotype, right? So this can be any stereotype. The purpose of a stereotype is to keep you in your place, right? In fact, all of the things that we're talking about, it's very intentional that we're going to fight for the little piece of meat that we have, right? And not look for the bigger things. Yeah. If you look at class issues, for example, 1% of the US we know dominates, let's say we have 10 chairs, they're dominating about 7 chairs. But what happens to all of us who are in the 3 chairs that are left over? We fight for lots of things, and this 1% is actually invisible to us. We don't see them. Right? So what ends up happening is then you have all these marginalized groups fighting for each other. What was the question? Model minority. Right, so back to stereotypes. So the danger of a stereotype is that we're going to keep people in a box. Right? And any stereotype does that. No matter whether you think it's a positive one or a negative one, it keeps people in a box. And that's very intentional. Why? Because society is a system. If you look at any type of systems, what do they do? They want to make sure that every role, right, is fulfilled and that you are going to play that role you're supposed to play. And if you think about it historically, why did we become the model minority, right? Society needed a role. The role was we needed a people group who are kind of like people of color, right? But still white enough, like off-white, if you will, where we can say, hey, look, this group is doing so well. What are you talking about? There's no discrimination. There's no what? There's no oppression. If there was, then this group wouldn't be so successful, right? And so we played this role. And in fact, again, going back to my earlier comment about that was not our choice, right? We didn't volunteer and say, we want to be that group. Use us and exploit our culture and use us as that. We didn't do that. But we were purposefully and intentionally placed in that so that the greater society could send a very strong message that if you indeed were not successful, then something's wrong with you, right? Because look at this group, right? Clearly there's no discrimination and oppression. But again, what that stereotype does is that it emotionally and psychologically places us in a box, right? Where it becomes a burden. Anybody burdened by that myth? Right? Where you feel like you have to be perfect. Another thing is it also prevents you from seeking help. Because first of all, you're not supposed to need help, right? You're doing so great. What do you mean you're suffering, right? What do you mean you're struggling with this thing? No, you can't be. You're Asian, right? And then what it also does is the general population also never reaches in for offering for help. Because the narrative is this group is doing so well, they don't need the help, so we're not going to reach out for help, and nobody's reaching in to give us help. That make sense?
I think that was wonderful. I work with middle schoolers, which is an amazing age. It's my favorite age to work with. No joke, it is the best. Axe body spray, acne, okay. So, but it is really, if you have not been in the classroom, I'm sure you all have been in the classroom, but this is the best age to teach. 7th grade is my prime zone. I love it. I am awkward, they are awkward. I am the queen of the awkward. But when you think about it, one of the developmental tasks of adolescence, right, is to come up with an identity, right? Is to form an identity separate from your parents, right? It's kind of like being 2 years old, right? When you are able to move independently of your parents, you learn the word no. Similarly, you go through that concrete to abstract thinking transition when you turn 13 and also learn the word no and get to act out the word no in many ways. And so one of the ways that white 13-year-olds benefit from being part of this society is that they get to see role models of many different types of identities, right? They get to imagine a three-dimensional identity, right? White people can be anything. They can be the quirky girl with bangs. They can be, free-flowing. They can be the, beautiful girl who's also a little smart sometimes, right? There's all kinds of things that white people can be. And so white teenagers get to imagine these things. If you are an Asian American teenager growing up, what can you be? Right, exactly. You can be a desexualized male. I think your poem just right? You can be, not I was talking about the poem.
I know what you were talking about.
Rewind.
You're red.
And thus my career in education ended. But you can be sort of, if you go through young adult literature, I spend a lot of time in our school library, right? Any book that references Asia, right? There's flowers on the cover, maybe a fan, right? And that's the only young adult literature available, right? So I think the purpose of these stereotypes, right, is to flatten the range of identities that children can aspire to. And I think this is a similar challenge, that Black youth face, that Hispanic youth face, that all children of color have sort of stereotyped figures, caricatures, if you will, that they can aspire to. And that can be very confusing and can be very challenging as you're trying to grapple with, the existing challenges of adolescence. And then you add to that trauma, you add to that growing up in poverty, you add to that all kinds of other situational factors. And it can really, really complicate the search for identity. And so I think that, I think to your point, what is the point of these systems? I think something that DeRay, right, McKeeson says all the time is that the systems work exactly the way they were designed to work. right? Like if we think about where whiteness came from, it was after Bacon's Rebellion, right? And like wealthy landowners were trying to think about a way to keep, slaves from rebelling and native indigenous populations from rebelling, and also indentured servants from rebelling. And so they had to come up with a way to describe the people who would have power in this new society. And at first they said European, but then they thought, oh, those Irish, right? And then they said, well, maybe Christian, but then they thought, well, someone could convert. And many indigenous people had converted. And so then they came up with this idea of calling it white, because that could be flexible, right? And so people with power could define who would be included in whiteness. And so these systems, like the conception of whiteness was created to create a power imbalance in society and to perpetuate it. And so I think that like the model minority myth, all of the different stereotypes that exist, to your point, exist to sort of further the like grappling for power among subgroups instead of us uniting together to dismantle the structures that exist.
What's that?
I feel like Joe and Kamal did a great job in answering the question. So I guess I'll add by talking about my own personal experiences. As a doctoral student, I took a course on African American psychology where we learned about how parents racially socialize their children about racism in American society, and they have the talk. And so it made me think about my own experiences growing up and the messages that my parents gave me. My dad, as I mentioned, had a 9th grade education, but he imparted a lot of messages that really helped me to cope with the stereotypes of being a model minority. So one of the messages he always gave me was always ask for help when you need it. If you don't understand something, just speak up. If you're asking, he mentioned that the only stupid question is the question that's never asked. And so after taking that class, it made me think for maybe 7 to 10 years before I actually had my own children. And now I have a toddler, actually 2 toddlers now. And I've been up since 3, so I'm really sorry that I haven't been very articulate. But I talk to my children about race and racism. I tell them how beautiful they are. My 4-year-old knows that she's Asian American. She knows she's Vietnamese. She also understands fairness, and we talk about racism all the time because I think it's really important for us as parents to also socialize our children to be really great allies. So we talk about how Black children experience racism, how it's really important to speak up. So I think these messages will help our children in terms of their racial identity development, as well as also being allies to other racial groups who experience oppression.
Amazing. Oh, kids. Middle school. I'm getting married soon, so I'm like already thinking around that route. I'm like, how do my future self? I know y'all are like cracking up now, my friends. But I think about that. I'm gonna be a good dad. I'm gonna try like Dr. Kimberly Trong. Like, I want to educate like right away on CRT and culture responsive teaching and pedagogy right away, so they're woke as fuck. Sorry, I went to Harvard, and I'm trying to be my authentic self. So that'll be a little bit of that today. So I appreciate you so much. Appreciate you. This last question is a quick one because I want to get the audience involved. I've been seeing some of y'all do this. So if we can shorten this to be like a minute long, it's a long question. But a minute answer, and then we'll jump to mics because I know some of y'all have like burning questions as well. How have the lack of visibility of social justice issues that are relevant to a large group of Asian Americans, such as like mental health disparities, immigrant status, LGBTQIA+ issues, refugee status, have previously harmed equity to opportunities for these groups? So I'm going to repeat it one more time. How have the lack of visibility of social justice issues that are relevant to the large group of Asian Americans, such as mental health disparities, immigrant status, LGBTQIA+ issues, refugee status, have previously harmed equity to opportunities for this group? And we'll just go to everybody.
Starting with me, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. I was going to say, how do you ever solve an issue or a problem? One of the first things, so I'm a counselor, and in counseling, one of the first things you try to get the person to do is, one, acknowledge that something might be off or something isn't working for them, right? The second thing is probably naming what that thing is, right? So naming it, acknowledging that it exists, right? That it's something that needs attention. And so if you're never naming it, if you're never acknowledging something exists, or you feel like you're going through something and yet it's not talked about or it's not named, it's not visible, then what often ends up happening is we only see and we only understand what's kind of reflected back to us, right? The reason so many of us want to be blonde and blue-eyed is because when you look out, that's what you see, right? And that's what's reflected back to you. And if you're not looking at a mirror constantly, at some point you're like, I must be blonde and blue-eyed. Anybody go through that? Yeah. And you're like, wait, looking in the mirror, why do I look this way, right? But again, the point is, we only see and understand the things that are reflected back to us. And if we're experiencing things and it's never given voice, nobody's naming it, nobody's talking about it, nobody's making it visible, then one, you feel like maybe it's not worth it, right? Maybe this issue that I'm going through is not worthy enough of people's attention. So again, because we're all internalizers, right? We internalize what we see and what's kind of reflected back to us. We're going to say, maybe what I'm going through is not important. And then as a child, especially, you're going to say, maybe I'm just not that important, right? And we're left with these messages. So again, if you don't acknowledge it, if you don't talk about it, name it, how can we come up with solutions for it? How can we ever improve on it? You really can't. Cosign.
I'll jump in. This is like a huge therapy session.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I agree with you that it has to be acknowledged. I often wonder about the mental health, how mentally healthy I was when I was growing up, and because I now understand like my identity was suppressed, day one when I started school in America. I know my language identity, I know my racial identity, I know my cultural identity. My mom wanted me to speak English as quickly as possible, so they stopped speaking Mandarin Taiwanese with me. I know they wanted me to have white friends because they wanted me to be American as quickly as possible, so that identity gets suppressed. And you're like trained and it's reinforced to be compliant and agreeable. But what happens when you get older in life? Because you haven't processed all that, you remain agreeable, you remain compliant. Then it translates to lacking agency and lacking courage. And as a result, it's hard to break through that bamboo ceiling, right?
Yep.
And I am the only Asian American superintendent of urban schools in the country, 70 plus urban schools. And I am constantly, though, I know that because of those experiences at an early age, I constantly remind myself each and every single day that I need to pull up a chair at the table, and I need to speak truth to power. And it's not easy for me. I have to work on it all the time. And when I'm advocating for other people of color to be school system leaders, I often have to tell school boards and headhunters and philanthropy and other powers that be that when you're looking at candidates and trying to make decisions on who is going to lead your school system, please don't discount that person that seemingly does not want and going to grab that job, because that person actually may be more qualified, but that person's been trained and told to wait their turn. So please look beyond that compliant, that agreeable nature. Look deeper than that. So.
I'll just raise one, I guess, personal experience too. So I'm openly queer, identify as pansexual, and it was actually hard for me when I became, well, not hard, but, well, tell the story. The Globe did like a article on me or whatever, and I was the first person of color to lead our union, and the first Asian American, and also first openly queer. And
Wait, yes.
and I had to make a decision of whether I wanted to out myself. And it was actually a little hard. And the reason I did, though, was because for the same reason my mom was embarrassed that I outed myself in the Globe, is the reason I did it. Was because I'm sure there are other young Asian American queer, questioning youth. And I know that when I was younger, I didn't see a lot of Asian American out queer APIA folks, right? And that was hard. And so I was like, well, I'm going to out myself, because if that helps one questioning queer Asian American student somewhere, then it's worth it, because even though it embarrassed my mom, that was kind of the point, was that that student shouldn't feel less or not feel like they can be themselves because of the cultural pressures of, coming out in our community, right? And so that's just another example, I guess, of why visibility does matter, and, exactly what you guys are saying already.
So just a quick 30-second piece. Again, being as a parent, I have 2 daughters, and they both have very feminine first names, and we're really intentional about their middle names being gender neutral. And so we talk about gender identity. I have a 4-year-old, so she mentioned something about, are you a boy or a girl? And then I said, well, some people don't identify as boys or girls, and then we have conversations about that. So just being able to start at home, if we don't do it within our own jobs or within research, it's really important.
Yeah. Last thing?
Oh, should I speak again?
Yeah. Want to add last before we...
Could get away with cosine, huh? I think this is really powerful. As a parent, I have 3 boys, and I think about, I'm just looking at the faces in this room while I'm hearing all of you guys speak, and I'm just seeing this collective and I just think that speaks to the power of hearing your story represented. And I think that the absence of representation clearly is a weight that many people have been carrying on their shoulders, because I'm seeing it, as you're listening to my colleagues here, I'm seeing your shoulders seem to lighten a bit, and I'm hearing that in sort of exhales. And just sort of, my big takeaway, I think, in answer to your question is, how can the weight that we collectively carry is the harm that is done. And to your point, right, you can't solve a problem if you can't name it.
Amazing. So we're going to move into this audience portion now. I know you guys are probably bearing a lot of questions. For this next portion, one caveat is, just for the sake of time, we're at 7:12 right now, and I want to make sure that we get as many questions as possible. So we are emphasizing questions as opposed to comments. And I know that some of y'all are going to say, thank you so much. That's amazing. That's great. But if we keep it to I'm going to be that person, okay? 10 to 15 seconds. Formulate your questions. I'll give you some think time right now. I was an educator for 7 years, so I know how it is. So you got 30 seconds right now to think of that question that you want to ask the panel. And if you can direct it to a few people on the panel based on their expertise, even better. Yeah. And if you feel so moved, to please just come to the mic. It's open mic time.
I've already tried.
Are we still thinking? Also distribute, maybe,
Oh, distribute. Yeah. We'll start from the right and then go to the left.
All right, I'm gonna be quick. Hi, I'm Michelle. I used to teach in BPS. Go Union. And my question is, how do you navigate conversations with other people of color who don't believe that you're a person of color or have a hard time believing in your allyship, which is fair based on, as we talked about, anti-Blackness in Asian communities?
Do you want to take it? You kind of
I don't know. Anyone can answer that one, I think.
Yeah, I never thought of myself as white until I came to the East Coast, and I was told I was white, and that was really confusing. But I do understand. You have to ask questions. You need to pull up a chair, and you need to understand why they don't believe you're an ally, and then be willing to tell your own stories. Earlier, I kind of joked around that whole binary thing, white versus people of color, but actually it's that simple. And when you haven't been affirmed, your identity hasn't been affirmed, that's immediately, I think you can find commonality. So asking questions and being very open about your own identity and lived experiences, it's for me.
I'll just add, and showing up and building the relationships and not just talking the talk but walking the walk. And I think that's how you build trust in any kind of situation, and mutual understanding and sharing your story and why you're there and why you care.
Amazing. Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to say I ended my teaching practicum a week and a half early, which is why I'm here right now. But the reason why is because my mental health was deteriorating. I was teaching at Northampton High School in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is primarily white. So you guys talked a little bit about how students have to navigate that, and I'm wondering if any of the teachers up there have any suggestions of how to continue teaching practicum or teaching in these predominantly white schools or schools that don't reflect your identity.
One thing I've been saying a lot to our students here is that sometimes you have to claim your voice and also claim space, and make something institutionalized, so it's not just this one thing you do. But I'm really talking about mobilizing with allies, but creating a space for Asian Americans. And if it doesn't exist, you have every right to create one, right? And nowadays, everybody's obligated to support you on it. And so that's talking about funding, that's talking about locations, whatever you need. And so if that doesn't exist, if it doesn't exist, especially right within your school, definitely in the district, maybe even broader, but creating something where you find that space where you can be recharged enough to be able to go back into your school and sustain. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I'm gonna just protocol, just because I know there's a ton of questions and a ton of people who want to get their questions out. Can we now just adapt to a one person answer, one question? Cool.
Hi, my name is Jeff. I graduated from Harvard and I'm an engineer now. But I wanted to thank you guys for coming, and my question may be for the guy in the middle. So I'm proud to be Asian, and I don't mind fitting into some of those model minority things, but I'm wondering, when did you most feel proud to be Asian?
Ooh. Wow, I've never had that asked before. I do. It was actually when I got much older, I was teaching, I was actually a principal of a school, and we were teaching ethnic studies to all ninth graders. Ooh. But what we did is we studied movements in American history where ethnic groups came together for common causes. So you study Yuri Koshina's work with Malcolm X. You study the work in California with Filipino farm workers, allying with Latino farm workers. I think when you study the deep history of resiliency and the kind of allyship among ethnic communities, I think that was probably when I was most proud. Mm-hmm. It's a great question. Yeah, keep that.
Great question.
Hi, my name is Mukesh. I graduated from UMass Boston, Conflict Resolution 2011, long time now. The question is, according to the Pew Research Center, the data that we have right now is 11 million, 11.5 million, 72% growth by 2015. We are 20 million in 2000, so 72% is the growth rate for Asian overall. By 2042, people of color would be the majority combined in the United States. So my question is, are we still thinking of snatching the 3 chairs that are with us, or with the demographic power, we are thinking of expanding our chairs as well? What's the strategy?
Who's that for?
Who's that for?
All you, Jessica.
I don't understand the question entirely, actually.
Can you clarify your question? Is it like, because while we may be a demographic, people of color may be a demographic majority, that doesn't mean that they have access to the power structures in place, right? And so I think, is your question, what do we make of that? Or is the question, like what becomes of the power grab? Well, then it becomes an apartheid power grab unless we do something dramatic, right? So like, can you clarify?
The question is more of like, do we still remain invisible and be satisfied with the 3 chairs and fight over it, or expand our chairs?
I would say expand.
Expand the chair.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, pull up a chair.
Definitely.
Hi, my name is Amy, and I am curious how you all, or one of you, would respond to something I hear a lot in excusing, I think, doing work in your own communities for Asian Americans. The excuse of it's in the culture to be anti-Black, homophobic, transphobic, sexist. That's part of Asian American culture. Obviously, it's not the case. So I'm curious, have you heard that before? How do you respond to that?
Okay, people are looking at me. All right. I just don't accept it. I just don't. And I think that if we really want to create the society we want to see, and we really believe in fighting for racial justice and all types of justice, then we have to address it in our own, if that is how we feel about our own culture, then we have to change our own culture. And so I've had lots of really difficult conversations with my parents, coming out to them was not easy, but they came around eventually. And, my partner right now is Black, and that was hard for them at first too. But if we don't actually take action to have those tough conversations with our families and our loved ones and change the culture from within, then what are we doing? So I don't accept that. And I think that if we accept that, then we're accepting all of the isms and perpetuating it.
I think just very quickly, so a lot of us come from nations where it was war-torn, poverty-stricken, lots of greater powers that be were trying to colonize us. And so at those points, you may develop an idea that if you're not one of us, I don't trust you, right? And so we have to contextualize that historically and to be able to say, at one point that actually did serve self-preservation, self-protection. Now that contexts have changed, it doesn't work for us anymore, right? So it's time to move on and stop calling, I think, dysfunction as culture, right? And call it for what it is.
Hi, my name is Julian. So when you were talking about our ancestors, I thought about some were oppressed, but others of my Asian ancestors were the oppressors. And that's not just true to me, that's true to a lot of places in Asia. And I was just wondering, even today there's still conflicts in Asia between different Asian groups. How do we deal with that as Asian Americans? And how does those conflicts define us, and how do we look past some of the atrocities that our Asian ancestors may have committed against other Asian groups, maybe against even other ethnic groups?
I think it's a great question, and I think it is a very American question to be asking, because one thing that the United States of America does really well is just whitewash the past and pretend that there were no atrocities ever committed, right? This is the nation built on genocide. And, yet where in the history books is that taught? And so just like many, and I think this should give us empathy for, our white allies, right? Like many people, like the German nation has to confront its history with the Holocaust, right? Like we can't just sit there and say, oh, this happened, like it's the past. This is a part of our identity, part of our culture that we need to grapple with, and it gives us a responsibility to understand it so that we can use the privilege and power that we have to dismantle the systems of oppression that exist and the ones that we are benefiting from and complicit in. And so I think it is a very heavy history that all of us carry, and it's just incumbent upon us to learn about it. And I think one of the sort of challenges of sort of erasing our connection to our cultures is that we don't get to explore those things. And we absolve ourselves of our responsibility to understand that, It's very easy for me to say, to ignore the oppression of the Dalit class in India, because I've been to India once in my life and I feel way more connection to the United States. But I need to understand what those dynamics are, because that is part of my culture.
Mm-hmm. So it's 7:25. Whew. We have time for one more question, but we will.
Wow. That's a lot of pressure to make this question good. Recently, in the news, there was a white girl in the suburbs of Salt Lake City who wore a T-pole to her prom dress, as her prom dress. I don't know if you guys know anything about this. And she said that she found it in a vintage shop, and she just really thought it made her look cool and exotic. So my question is, what is the good line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation in under 1 minute?
My culture is not a costume, period. If I would get beat up for wearing it, you can't wear it.
That was 15 seconds.
Yeah, sounds pretty good.
Yeah. Rapid fire round.
So I grew up in a community that was very split. Either you're white or you weren't. And something that I've noticed from the time when I was in elementary school up until now in college is that a lot of the times, as a person of color myself, when I try to have these conversations with other Asian Americans, they often distance themselves away from me and are like, I'm not a person of color, or oh, you're black, you don't understand what it's like. I'm going to put myself in more of a category for white people. And I do understand that there are Asian Americans who do think like that, so I guess what would you say to them?
Make an appointment with me.
Dang, look at goodness.
Yeah, and that's the greater narrative here, right? That we've all been taught, again, this role that we play in society is to do just that, to be the off-white and to be okay with it, right? And so I think that's many years of internalizing that message. And it's very painful to look at, because a part of it's unpacking privilege, a part of it's looking at your own oppression, and that's always painful. And so for me, just as a counselor, the general rule all the time to have these very difficult conversations is to cushion it first with some sort of rapport, right? So that means you have to talk about it, talk about some other things before you get to this issue. But once you have a relationship, once people know that where you're coming from, right, is genuine and it's authentic, then I do think you can have these conversations in a more nuanced way, and people are more ready, I would say, to talk about it, right? So maybe build that relationship first.
So it is 7:27, and let's take 2 quick ones, and then I'm gonna close this out so you can have actual more time with the speakers as well and the panelists, and then enjoy the reception as well, because I'm sure some people are hungry. And also there's a follow-up processing space as well, led by Harvard Equity Fellows here. Both Andy and Henri are willing to have that space in Larson Geo 8. So if you have questions, please bring it to that space as well, starting at 7:40. Okay, let's do this.
I'm going to apologize ahead of time because I'm going to try and make this short, but I don't know if it is.
Got it, that's right.
I'm Malik. I'm one of the few black engineers that work at MIT. So I think coming into the States, if you're not white, you're viewed as an outsider, no matter what. And you always fall under that system of oppression. And when you factor in finding self-identity, cultural identity, ethnic identity, I believe that, you know, with me, I think about what it means to be a person of color. But by the same token, I feel like a lot of African Americans are still searching for the opportunity to be considered a person in general, not just in the past through dehumanization and slavery, but now through violence you're seeing now through police violence and whatnot. How do you, within the people of color community, how do you draw that line to understand that, you know, like for myself, you know, still trying to not only figure out self-identity, ethnic identity is almost untraceable, and becoming a human in this society. How do you draw that line within your community to kind of make the things that you do or the problems that you tackle more something that you tackle more efficiently?
I'm struggling with the question, actually. I'm trying to draw the line. What do you mean by drawing the line?
So I think it's hard for, of course, it's hard for like all black people to see everyone else as a people of color. And I think it is primarily within the black culture due to the fact that we're still searching to be human in some form. And I think that line has to, you know, it's a line that has to be respected, acknowledged, and understood, so that people of color is not just a general term that you're going to use to just because you're not white. So when you acknowledge, you respect, and you work around that line, how do you do so efficiently so that, you know, you optimize the solution for everyone instead of just yourselves?
I'll just say very quickly that I think one is acknowledging that our experiences aren't shared, and again, going back to, you know, we can't be in a space where like I'm more oppressed than you, or, you know, I'm more down than you. It's how do we actually have a shared analysis and also create the space. So I'm thinking about like BLM. You know, there's a whole APIs for BLM, and we understood that our space was following the lead of, you know, the BLM activists, right? Is how do we support and not how do we lead, and knowing our space and place in different struggles, kind of going back to, you know, who's most impacted and how, and not being offended too. If there needs to be like a black only space, that's cool. That's needed, you know? Just like sometimes Asian Americans want to have like, you know, an APIA space, right? And so I think just being conscious of that as much as I think we do have the importance of allyship and, you know, this, sorry, I'm thinking Audre Lorde, she has a really good quote, and I can't remember the quote though, but this sense that, you know, that we have intersections, and there is a space and place for that, and there's also a space and place for different groups to have their own space, essentially. And again, we can't talk about racism without talking about anti-blackness, right? And the black experience too. And I think it's something we just have to be aware of, so that we aren't overstepping and making sure that anything that we're doing isn't at the expense of another group. Right. And I think that's really important, is that we have to lift all boats, right? Not just if something helps one group and hurts another, then that's not a good solution at all. And I think we always have to think about who is this oppressing, who's not in the room, and who does this impact.
This work is not efficient. I don't know. I I don't know what the exact word you use, but it isn't. You gotta acknowledge it. And we in Boston Public Schools, we've been talking a lot about targeted universalism and the importance of that work. And it's uncomfortable, and people are confused. People's feelings are hurt. But you acknowledge it's not. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be efficient. It's okay. It shouldn't be efficient.
I think just to add 2 points. I do very many times struggle to identify as Asian American and to claim myself as a person of color, because I do believe that like the experience of Black Americans is we're not playing the oppression Olympus, but is like the Black community has far less social power than we do as Asian Americans. Like it just is, and the oppression that I have faced is not the same in any way. But I think, if you want an efficient answer, I think we have to just be consciously mindful when we organize and when we are here in affinity spaces. It is important for us to share our stories. It is important for us to identify as people of color. But our goal is not the power grab. Our goal is not to say like, we are going to elevate our community. Our goal is justice, right? And that means a more just society for all members, right? Which means dismantling the systems that exist. And in that, like if our goal is justice, it means we have to think about ourselves as strong allies to the Black communities, not center our voice, but make sure that we are being powerful allies and elevating the goal of justice. And I think I don't know how to do that efficiently, but I think that we must always efficiently state our goal so that it is not confused.
I think we can sit in the pain together, right? So I can sit in your pain together, and hopefully you'll sit in my pain together and stand together. And also recognizing that when we push your agenda forward, we're also pushing ours forward. Because it's the same agenda.
That's right.
Essentially, right? We're the 3 chairs wanting the 7 chairs. It's the same agenda. I would also go beyond even allyship. I think allyship in some ways is easy to do. As long as somebody's doing the acting, I can go stand there, right? But this also calls for, I'm borrowing the words of Tahari Jackson, who is here, who really talks about becoming a disruptor by yourself. You don't need this one person to act to be an ally. You yourself can actually do the act. And I hope, that urges all of us to become that. Right? And not just an ally, but definitely sitting in the pain together. The difference is that we do have, but it's still pain, right? That we can do that, and also never forgetting that pushing the Black agenda forward is pushing our Asian American agenda forward too.
So, on that note, that was beautiful, both Kamal and Dr. Joseph King. So quick snaps for both of them too as well. Then whole entire panel, that was amazing. I want to emphasize that we want to continue this conversation in Larson GOA. And we want to make sure we respect people's time. Y'all came out here, put this in your calendars, and we respect that. And we are gracious that you're here. I want to do quick thank yous and then a send-off for y'all as well to think about, as well as we come together in solidarity as well. So I want to thank really quick... there's a lot of people to thank. There's like 10 groups to thank, because 10 sponsors. So I'm going to just go rapid fire. Equity Fellows. If you are one of these, you can shout yourself out. If you like them, shout them out. Equity Fellows. Let's Talk Conference. Harvard University Asia Center. TAPAS, which stands for Task Force for Asian Pacific American Studies. The Lakshmi Mittal South Asian Institute. BPS. Boston Teachers Union. PACE. Also, there's going to be the Harvard Kennedy School Asian American Policy Review right outside. We're selling that, and if you want to look into more of the resources, yourself as well is also published in it. Andy is one of the senior editors on our team. Read from us. I honor and pay homage to a lot of the Black community as well, because I understand that I, as a Filipinx American, can't do this work without understanding other forms of oppression in intersection, right? So I urge you to check that out. It's on discount as well. And thank you, Dr. Joe, for being an amazing mentor for many of us here. She's been working on the ground. with us this entire year, and that's one thing that as students, especially Asian Americans and Asians here, are looking for. Professors who are willing to be on the ground with us, and not just working for us and working with us. So thank you so much. We love you. Yes. And with that, thank you all for coming and join us for the reception. Thank you so much.